A massive bolt of lightning crashes into the ground, completely devastating everything in its path. And the terrifying power behind it belongs to a man known as the Fist King, a warrior who had mastered Jiang Yu with his own bare hands. His reputation had become so legendary that almost everyone had forgotten his real name. That name was Dan Woozing. The legendary fighter now stood in the middle of a ruined battlefield, facing a situation that had taken an unexpected and deadly turn. His expression was filled with shock. In his arms was one of his comrades, seriously wounded and barely clinging to life. Something had gone horribly wrong. Dan believed they had been caught off guard by an ambush from a mysterious group, and now, after the battle, he was completely alone in the middle of the desolate battlefield. Bodies of his enemies were scattered everywhere. But when Dan looked toward a nearby cliff, he noticed something strange. Two opponents were still standing, and judging by their presence alone, these two weren't exactly amateurs. Dan wondered where they had come from. Despite being exhausted and surrounded by destruction, his determination never wavered. Instead, he decided to return their fallen subordinate. So he grabbed the body and threw it toward them. One of the men immediately begged his leader, the Sword Demon, to save him. But the Sword Demon didn't even hesitate. Instead, he killed his own companion. Dan's eyes widened. He had seen plenty of ruthless people in his life, but watching someone casually eliminate his own ally was something else entirely. The Sword Demon clearly wasn't interested in playing fair, and Dan wasn't about to let that slide. The symbol on the man's sword caught Dan's attention. Combined with his merciless behavior, it suddenly gave Dan a clue about who he was dealing with. The pieces began falling into place. Dan finally recognized them. Could these two really belong to the demonic faction? The Sword Demon seemed impressed that the legendary Fist King had figured it out. He even praised Dan for surviving this long. But Dan wasn't interested in hearing it. He simply told him to shut up. Dan's anger was reaching its limit. He confidently declared that he would defeat the Sword Demon in just 10 blows. Apparently, even after getting ambushed and nearly exhausted, Dan still had enough confidence to make a 10-hit challenge. The Sword Demon found his confidence amusing. To him, Dan's declaration sounded less like courage and more like arrogance. So he charged forward, eager to see whether the legendary Fist King's reputation was actually deserved. The Sword Demon attacked with incredible speed, but Dan wasn't finished yet. He defended himself and countered with his electrified fists, moving so quickly that the Sword Demon was caught off guard. Then Dan landed his first punch. 1. And just like that, the countdown had begun. Dan prepared for his second strike, then the third, then the fourth. His fists came down like a storm, giving the Sword Demon almost no time to react. 5. 6. But then something changed. Dan's attack suddenly stopped connecting with the weak points. Confused, he looked up and realized he had a problem. A woman, the Sword Demon's accomplice, had secretly wrapped him in purple energy wires. Dan was furious. He hadn't even noticed when she managed to restrain him. And unfortunately, that tiny distraction was all the Sword Demon needed. The Sword Demon retrieved his weapon. Before Dan could break free, he drove the sword straight through his chest. Dan suffered massive damage from the attack. The Sword Demon coldly declared that the reign of the legendary Fist King had finally come to an end. Dan was barely standing. The Sword Demon looked down at his nearly powerless opponent with a victorious smile. But then, Dan reached out and grabbed the blade with his bare hand. The confidence immediately disappeared from the enemy's face, because Dan wasn't finished. Not yet. With the last of his strength, Dan released one final burst of energy. The Sword Demon watched the destruction unfold with a satisfied smile. The resulting explosion ripped through the battlefield, leaving behind a massive crater and a trail of destruction. The woman eventually joined him and admitted that the situation had been far more dangerous than expected. The sword demon then approached Dan's fallen body. Instead of showing respect to the legendary warrior, he mocked him. He thought the Fist King was finally finished. He was wrong. With almost nothing left in the tank, Dan gathered the last bit of strength in his body. Then he threw one final punch. Bam! The fist connected directly with the sword demon's face, and with that, Dan had completed his 10th blow. The sword demon was left completely stunned. Dan could feel his life fading away. He knew his reign as the Fist King had finally come to an end. But as he prepared to die, there was one thing he regretted. He wished he could have punched that bastard. One more time. And just like that, Dan Woozing, the legendary Fist King, was defeated by the demonic faction. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Meanwhile, far away at a safe house on Joa Mountain, something completely unexpected was taking place. A mysterious crow watched silently as a young woman moved around inside one of the rooms. Then suddenly, someone woke up. The young woman immediately rushed over to check on her master. She asked about his condition while the man looked around in complete confusion. He had absolutely no idea where he was. Then he looked down at his body. His injuries were gone. The young woman continued calling him young master, which only made things even more confusing. He accepted the water she offered him, but the title still bothered him. First young master? What the hell was she talking about? Then he looked into the mirror and froze. The face staring back at him wasn't his. He looked down at his hands. They were different too, smaller, younger, and definitely not the hands of the legendary Fist King. Dan completely lost it. In a panic, he desperately tried to pull the supposed mask off his face. But there was no mask, no disguise, no trick. That unfamiliar face was actually his new face. The young woman could only stare at him, completely confused by her master's strange behavior. Seeing how distressed he was, she immediately offered to call a doctor. Once she left the room, Dan continued staring at his hands. He couldn't understand what had happened. He began thinking through every possibility, and eventually, one terrifying possibility came to mind. Even the demonic faction shouldn't have possessed the ability to do something like this. There was no strange energy inside his body, no obvious sign of witchcraft. So who was the person staring back at him from the mirror? Dan decided there was only one way to find out. He needed answers. He tried standing up and immediately stumbled. The body was ridiculously weak. Dan compared it to a baby deer and complained about how useless it was. For someone who had once been the legendary Fist King, this new body was basically an insult. He eventually collapsed into a chair and called it complete trash. Then something on the table caught his attention. There were documents scattered across the table. They mentioned a powerful merchant organization known as the Inhume Merchant Group. Dan continued reading. The documents were addressed to someone named Li Jin, and that's when the truth began to become clear. The body Dan was now inhabiting belonged to Li Jin, the eldest son of the household. But judging by the documents, Li Jin wasn't exactly what you'd call a model son. The requests were mostly about money, gambling, and women. Dan quickly came to a conclusion. The previous owner of this body was a complete failure. Dan ruled out the possibility of a mask or some kind of illusion. There was no strange energy either. The only explanation that made sense was almost impossible to believe. He had been reincarnated. Dan sat there wondering if he'd finally lost his mind. Then suddenly, "First young master!" someone called from outside. A doctor rushed into the room, asking if he was all right. Dan immediately became suspicious. Who was this guy? The doctor explained that he'd heard something was wrong and quickly grabbed Dan's wrist to check his pulse. Dan calmly told him that everything was fine. The doctor relaxed. He then explained that he had prepared the young master's usual meal. When the food arrived, Dan immediately recognized it: chicken soup. And there was a problem. The soup might be healthy for an ordinary person, but it was apparently dangerous for the body he now inhabited. Dan also remembered the doctor checking his pulse earlier. Something about the situation didn't feel right, but the doctor happily explained that the soup would help make him as strong as the young men competing in an upcoming martial arts competition. That caught Dan's attention. Dan asked about the competition, and the answer nearly broke his brain. 200 years had passed. 200 years. Dan refused the soup, claiming he wasn't hungry, and sent the doctor away so he could rest. But now his mind was racing. If the martial arts competition was already approaching its 200th edition, then not much time had passed since his death. That realization actually gave him some relief. And if 200 years wasn't enough to erase the competition, then the demonic faction probably still existed too. Dan's suspicions grew. The people around him could be enemies. The doctor could be an enemy. This entire household could be hiding something. Dan's expression became cold. There were people out there who deserved to be punished, and this time, he wouldn't need 10 punches. He would finish all of them with a single punch. And that is where the story of the reincarnated Fist King truly begins.